So please welcome the first speaker on stage for Maximum Occupancy 2023, Paul Hammond from STR.
Kia ora. Good morning, everybody. And thanks, Adrian, so much for the opportunity to be here and to present to everyone today on behalf of STR. Maximum occupancy, or more aptly perhaps it's maximum ADR at the moment in the current scheme of things. I've labelled this presentation as taking stock because it's really been the last 12 to 18 months where we've really been trying to get back up on our feet. So it's really just an opportunity to reflect on all of that, have a look at some stuff. I'm going to be referring to some comparisons to pre-COVID 2019 time frames and also even year on year, so last year comparisons, and even some forward-looking data as well going forward. At the very end, there's also a QR code, so you can grab a photo of the QR code at the very end if you like, and that can get you a copy of this presentation to PDF as well. But I'll click on through, get through as many of these numbers as I can. Too many numbers probably for some, that's why I've only got like 3 friends, but we'll do it as quickly and as entertaining as possible as we can make numbers be. So looking at a quick global scheme as we like to do, we like to have a little bit of a look at the global picture. You can see here, if we look at the comparisons in terms of where occupancy currently sits, everywhere is pretty much globally in a place where it used to be pre-COVID, more or less, or close to. Even China's now joined the party. Travel is obviously restricted at a much lesser degree anywhere in the world, which means that travellers are therefore responding to that. And then contrast, it's at average daily rate, which you can see globally speaking, with the exception of China, which is still coming to the party. And there's inflation stories and other economic wider impacts. Is that probably better? Is that better? Hello? Can you hear me better with this, or is it on? Yeah. You can hear me already? Do I need it? Hold it? Okay, certainly. Been told. I'm holding it. Oh, that's better. There we go. You can see that the ADR increases are up around that 20 to 30%, mostly in most regions around the world. But as I said, there's some complications, or implications rather, probably a better word, in terms of China and where it's at in terms of its current story with inflation, with the dreaded I word. Now, Matthew Burke, my colleague in STR, I think laid claim with his 3-year-old daughter putting some lines together. She's getting very good at this, apparently, so you can see. This is my favourite slide, but you can see that this is basically just a spaghetti of lines to give us a bit of an understanding in terms of APAC regions, where things are converging, and things that are actually having an impact to that is how early they were able to reopen in terms of their region. And then also things like access to air capacities, international, but also domestically, what they've got to drive that domestic audience as well as a market to their market as well. And by comparison, you can see with Australia and New Zealand, that's very much a story. We've got a domestic engine in Australia versus here in New Zealand, where we've been able to close that gap a little bit more compared to pre-COVID levels in particularly more recent times, whereas for New Zealand, it hasn't quite got there. We're getting there. So if we look at the scorecard in terms of what we do at STR, we look at things like occupancy, RevPAR, and we can see that across the board here, broadly speaking, it's things like ADR and RevPAR which have met the mark, and that RevPAR is very much underpinned by that ADR story, which we'll talk to more in detail. But also in positivity, it's at on the books forward bookings, as well as also getting back to levels of pre-COVID. So there's a yes and no answer to that question. Are we back to recovery as just yet in New Zealand, which I'm sure you can all attest to. And it is different from one region to another, of course. This is broadly speaking, again, across the nation. And we're looking here, we're still, that 20 to 25% below where we would like to be in terms of recovery to pre-COVID times, in terms of occupancy. And you can see that things have really sort of stagnated there in terms of, more recent months. But it is starting to get there, and it will get there. If you look at that at a longer term, this is a different lens or different perspective. You can see that the average is actually not as far away. So it's only about 10 points off, in fact, if you look at it over 10 to 11-year average. But you can see it's still about 20 to 25% away in terms of where we'd like it to be in terms of occupancy or demand levels pre-COVID. And then conversely, that average daily rate, we're looking here at month-to-month average daily rates, and this is the percentage change year on in terms of year on year, or to 2019 rather. And you can see here, even up till May, that those really strong numbers, those strong ADR performances haven't given up, which is fantastic. Even despite the lesser desired occupancies, those ADRs are really kicking in, and that's what's really underpinning performance for overall RevPAR. And you can see there, even for those recent months, the last few months, we can see that's what's underpinning that performance. And even for April, which is that softer dip that we all sort of encountered in that month, you can see that even RevPAR for that month was up and above 2019 levels, comparatively speaking. And then you can looking here, what we've done here is we've extrapolated occupancy. This is looking from the beginning of the year in comparison again to pre-COVID, so 2019, so from January through to June. And you can see for those 6 months we extrapolated, so you can see the comparison between those shoulder days to weekends to weekdays. And there's not a lot of contrast. It's actually quite consistent between all of those days. In contrast, average daily rate is all up and above that 100% mark indexing to 2019 levels. And there's a bit of an edge in terms of that weekend, which is a good thing. That leisure, domestic, leisure audience is certainly helping to drive and influence that overall. And when it comes to market classes across New Zealand, it's that mid-scale and economy class. It's the lowest level, has seen the lowest level of new supply, and that's helped its recovery overall. Whereas those top 4 levels from that upper mid-scale up to luxury have seen a sort of an increase of around that 6 to 8%. So it's had a bit of an adverse effect in those spaces. But in saying that, you can see that across the board where they're currently at in comparison to one another. And then in terms of, to add to this, that mid-scale and economy class have seen a higher percentage change off arguably a lower base in terms of average rate comparisons, but they're punching above and pushing higher. Now I'm looking here across the nation in terms of comparisons of RevPAR. We're looking at a short window in that dark purple line versus a longer window in that light purple. So that longer light purple one is looking at a rolling 12-month versus a short, which is the darker rolling 3 purple line. And so you can see it almost looks like a north versus south sort of a scenario there if you look at that. And then also you can see contrast of places like, for instance, Christchurch, where you can see it's sort of stagnant for that longer term, but if you look at the shorter term window in isolation for the last 3 months, it's actually had a fairly positive time frame versus somewhere like Wellington. If you look at it in contrast, it's been actually it's almost like the reverse. It's had a longer positivity window in that last 12 months, but if you look at a short term, it's had a more adverse. And there could be relative things to that in terms of what's been happening. It's an election year, we know. We'll talk to more in Wellington more specifically and so forth, and the impacts towards October for that. But these are the sorts of things that are happening nationally. Like other parts of the world, New Zealand has had its economic impacts, as we know. Interest rate hikes have had their impacts, and of course impacts that the interest rates are there to help slow demand. And it'd be naive of us to think that it's not having an impact of it on us here in New Zealand. But it wouldn't be just that. I don't think that we could, and I'm going to show you why I think that in terms of this frame here. So I'm going to use the proxies of Rotorua and Queenstown to show you these 2 leisure destinations and where they've seen occupancy on a year-on-year basis, and that decline, particularly in that April period before it started to pick up again. And you might look at that and say, okay, it wasn't so good when you look at that prior year comparison. That's comparing 2022, last year, to this year. But then if you look at that in comparison to pre-COVID year, you can actually see it's really just a normalisation of where things were. Yes, there's still that dip, but you can see that things have somewhat normalised into where they were in terms of demand for those destinations. If you look at the comparison then to average daily rates for those 2 destinations, there are wider implications to that, and there's a different narrative perhaps to what's happening there. And you can see that, but the thing they have in common is that they are tapering or getting to levels similar to what they have before. I'm just going to take Queenstown into a view here now. We're going to look here at the increased supply. And you can see here that the region has been impacted, particularly in that upscale and upper mid-scale. You can see the impacts they've had, that flattening of that ADR in that particular class or collapsed class, and that suppressed occupancy in that classes and in that collapsed class as well. This is a forward-looking view, so we're looking forward data. This is actually looking as of last Monday, the 19th of June. This is looking in the next 90 days. So we're looking at same time last year in that blue line versus those green bars, which is showing us this time the occupancy on the books for this year. So you can see the promising thing here is that it's all looking very much a mirror to what it was in last year with those vertical bars. So that's a promising thing going forward. I'm going further up to Christchurch now to have a look at the view there and how it's performing. So we were looking here at occupancy versus ADR, and you can see there that, you know, things like the convention centre there is starting to bring back some great, well-missed business to the region. And it's, you know, it's sort of teetering there behind in terms of where it was in 2019 levels. But the thing we can see here that's quite distinct is that average daily rate is sitting well and truly above where it was pre-COVID times. So there's a new premium. And looking forward, this is the same view I had for Christchurch before from the last Monday, the 19th of June. Looking forward for the next 90 days. Again, promising to see that for the most part, it's either equal to or above same time last year, which is that blue line. And then Wellington. So some anomalies or some different things happening there this year with Wellington. It was first out of the tracks in terms of comparing to Auckland. But there's been also some adverse things that have happened in that space as well, particularly in the north earlier in this year. We know with the floods and the cyclone impacts of that region, how things are dispersed there. But in saying that, there are some things to be mindful of in terms of where Wellington is at now and where it's heading to. Of course, there's events like the FIFA, and of course I mentioned earlier that there's the election year. So there's all these different factors to factor in. But there are less events in general too, that I'm sure that everybody's also on their minds in terms of previous years. Again, I'm extrapolating here, again, a view of Wellington specifically, but this is looking at the weekend versus weekday and shoulder day comparisons. Once again, there's a fairly even view. It's a fairly even contribution across the week. Auckland, unlike other capital cities around the world, aren't quite seeing that recovery in weekends, which is probably fair to expect given that they've also had an addition of supply to the region, but it's also other conditions which may be influencing that. Adversely, average daily rate is certainly well above on all dates, and even on those weekends, and that's great to see, especially given that there's in the background there's that reduced discretionary spend available to a lot of people as well. And if we look at that in a view, this is looking at a year-on-year change. So we're looking at comparing to the year prior to 2022. This is both occupancy and average daily rate. There were diminishing levels of quarantine to take into account in Auckland in last year, but you can also see that weekend occupancy is lower than 2022, but you can see that striking average daily rate up, nearly 30 points on some dates, comparatively speaking to year on year. And then, strangely enough, looking at all classes, all collapse classes that is, so each of the 6 classes collapsed into 2 of each, you can see that the occupancy ADR is pretty much uniform across the board. Supply has been a factor, as I mentioned earlier, so this demonstrates that there is some rooms to come still, particularly over that 23-24 summer period. So there is that bedding down, pardon the pun, of those new rooms expected in the region as well, which is definitely having an impact. But looking forward, this is probably what I like to see is, the most promising thing of all is that the forward demand, this 28-day expected occupancy, it's where it's on the books. And this is what we like seeing is this alignment in terms of, yes, it's becoming more aligned, but it's already up and above. So we continue to see these sorts of levels of occupancy on the books going forward. We can only expect that that's going to be up and above compared to where they were in previous. And then it's the same for pickup as well. It's pretty much tracking to where it was or would expect to be. We can see that that's having also that impact going forward in terms of what that looks like. And then you can see that just from the views I was showing with Queenstown and Christchurch earlier. This is forward bookings again from the 19th of June last week. Looking forward, you can see that those occupancies are well and truly above. Hopefully, I'm sure that FIFA is definitely having an impact to that. But there's also some other notables that are also having an impact as well. But it's good to see some spiking dates over the FIFA World Cup as well. So now we're just having a quick look, thanks to our friends at Tourism Economics, in terms of forecast, before I hand over to Stephen, and I'm going to show you that QR code in a moment as well. But you get a view here in terms of comparisons to somewhere like Sydney and Melbourne, where Auckland sits in terms of forecast. The things that Auckland shares in common with somewhere like Melbourne is they're bedding down that new room supply, of course. So that's one thing that's, it's weighing them both down in comparison to somewhere like Sydney. But essentially, 3 years removed from, one of the hardest and lowest performing times ever, to see where things are at, pre-COVID times in 2023 and going forward, it's a fair effort considering the circumstances. So in summary, I'm going to let you all digest that yourselves, but in summary, I just want to say that bottom line I'll turn to, and the economic outlook is that it's optimistically it's optimistic. I guess it's cautiously optimistic is probably a summary I'll put it to you. And then there's challenges, of course, domestically, as we mentioned, the same performance. And there's also this opportunity in terms of where Summer's aiming for as well. And that's the QR code I promised you. So grab a photo if you like. And we can send you a copy of that presentation as a QR code. But thank you so much. And I'll hand you on to Stephen to set the scene for the future. Thank you.